All right, so we're started. Fair warning, I'm working on my laptop and it is a small screen, so I'm sorry if I end up clicking out of something or having some technical difficulties. I'll do my best. All right, so welcome to the Otters and Beavers and Muskrats Oh My program with Fish and Wildlife. So your hosts today are me, I am Gabby. I am the Technical Outreach Assistant from the Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife, RIDEM Fish and Wildlife. And then also we have with us as an added bonus is John Crockett. And he is a URI graduate student, University of Rhode Island. He's working on a partner project between DEM and URI studying otters and beavers and muskrats. So he's going to talk in a little bit about his research and what he's found so far, because he just started last year. So before we get started talking about these animals, I wanted to just mention some of the cool places and some of the activities that we do at Fish and Wildlife. So one of them is we help to manage some of the wildlife habitat in the state. So we help manage over 60,000 acres of land on our wildlife management areas. And these are located all over the state. A lot of them are in the western part of the state because there's just more forest and more habitat over there for us to conserve. And in these places, they're protected forever for wildlife. So you can't build houses there. You can't put a road through there. They're just meant to be habitat for wildlife. And they also provide hunting opportunity, which I'll talk about on the next slide. If you want to go there and ride your bike or you want to go there and hike, you're more than welcome to do that because they're beautiful. We've got the Great Swamp Management Area down in West Kingston where our Great Swamp office is. We've got Arcadia, which is a huge management area. We've got George Washington way up north. Got Sepauwett on the East Bay. I know some of you are coming in from the East Bay. So lots of beautiful spaces for you to come and visit and for wildlife to live. So now I mentioned there are hunting opportunities. And for these opportunities to happen, it's great because it's a user pay system. So a lot of people think hunters are bad, they kill animals. Well, that's not really the case. So hunters usually are really big conservationists because if you think about it, if I were a hunter and I went out and I killed all the animals that I could, and I took as many as I could, whenever I felt like it, there wouldn't be very many animals left the next year. And also hunters care a lot about the environment because they spend so much time out there. Usually if someone goes out to try to hunt, they're not really going to catch anything the first time, the second time, maybe not even the third time, but they're sitting out there, enjoying nature, seeing birds, having birds, land on their arrow as they're trying to shoot archery. So it's really an amazing way to enjoy nature in a different way. So because hunters are using this resource, this natural resource, they have this system that's a user pay system called the Wildlife and Sportfish Restoration Program. So really basically what it is that when hunters buy their firearms, their ammunition, their archery equipment, a little piece of that money goes up to the federal government, and then it's distributed throughout the states, and the states have to use that money to conserve wildlife, to do research projects, to protect habitat, to do hunter education, to do this program I'm doing today. This is all funded by hunters and anglers. And also when people buy their trapping license or their hunting license, they also contribute money to help with all these conservation projects in the state. So everyone doesn't have to be a hunter, but I think it's important to understand where they're coming from and respect them because they do play a really big part in conservation. And that being said, to respect hunters, it's really nice to wear orange in the management areas. It's actually required for most of the year. So in this graphic, you can see you have to wear fluorescent orange from the middle of September all the way until the end of May. And that just helps you be more visible so that hunters don't have to be so concerned about people walking by. But then in the summertime, you don't need to wear orange. You're free to go wearing whatever color you want. So that is enough about that. We'll get started with our semi-aquatic mammal program. So can anyone type in the chat and tell me what a semi-aquatic mammal is? So think about the words aquatic and mammal. right? So I see live on land and in the water, half water, half land. So it spends part of its life in the water. So you guys got the semi-aquatic part. Live in water and land, absolutely. What about the mammal part? So what is a mammal? Warm-blooded, yeah, has fur. So egg laying, so it gives live birth. So mammals have live birth, things like reptiles and birds lay eggs. Awesome, you guys are great. Live birth, perfect. You got it. So semi means partly, aquatic, water, partly water, and mammals are those things that have live birth. They have got hair, they're warm-blooded. So things like a beaver, which we have pictured here. So in Rhode Island, we have a few different kinds of semi-aquatic mammals. Who can name them all? You should know because it's the name of this program. Muskrats, beavers, otters, muskrats. Yes, you got it. Woo! So beavers and otters and muskrats. Oh my. So we've got these three semi-aquatic mammals. So we'll start with the beaver. Oh, we've got water shoes. Good job. And mink will sometimes go in the water, but they're a little bit different. So I'll start off with the beaver. So beavers, they're our largest semi-aquatic mammal that we have here in Rhode Island. They're actually the largest rodent in the United States. They can weigh up to 60 pounds if they have lots of good stuff to eat. And they, like I said, they're semi-aquatic mammals, so they live partly in the water, partly on land. They've got this nice thick fur, and they have a horizontally flattened tail, so it's flattened this way. We also have otters in Rhode Island. So these are the really cute ones that everybody loves. These are river otters. So river otters are different than sea otters. We have no sea otters here in Rhode Island. Sea otters live in the Pacific Ocean. So not over on this side. They're the ones that are, they're really cute. They lay on their back, they eat the sea urchins, and they live in those kelp forests. So here we have river otters. They can go into salt water. They don't have a huge issue doing that, but you'll probably be more likely to see them in a river in fresh water, not in salt water. And otters are a little bit smaller than beavers. They weigh kind of up to 30 pounds. Their tails look like tubes, so they're rounded, they're not flattened. And we'll go more in depth into their teeth and the way other parts of their body that help them survive in the water. And then lastly, we have the muskrat. So muskrats, people a lot of times confuse for like a Norway rat or some other kind of rodent. But these guys, the way to tell that it's a muskrat versus a different kind is looking at their tails again. So while beavers have their tails horizontally flattened like this way, muskrats have their tails flattened this way, vertically, just like this. So when they swim back and forth like this. So you'll see their tail like this as they swim through the water. It's a really good sign that you're looking at a muskrat versus a different kind of rodent. And muskrats are really small. So muskrats and beavers look a lot alike, but muskrats are much smaller. They only weigh up to 4 pounds, and their tails are different, like we said. We also, there are nutria in other parts of the US. These look really similar to muskrats, but they're actually invasive and they come from South America. So they don't really belong here. And they have a lot more white on their face. So that's one of the ways that you can tell them apart. But we haven't really seen any here in Rhode Island. But in case you see something and you're wondering, it looks a little bit different than the muskrat that I've seen before, maybe send us a photo because we'd love to hear about that so we can take action because they can be very damaging to the environment. So we have our first trivia. So we've got A, B, and C, and these are different tails from the different species. So put in the chat who you think tail letter A belongs to. What do we think? You guys are great. picking up on it so quick. Yep, so A is otter, you got it. So looking at tails is a great way to tell them apart, because sometimes you might be looking from really, really far away and you can't tell if something's big or small. So being able to tell the difference between the tails is really helpful. A is an otter. All right, how about B? What do we think for B? Awesome, B is for beaver. You got it. So it's got that horizontally flattened tail this way. Awesome. All right, how about for C? What do we think C is? Muskrat. You got it. So C is muskrat. It's flattened this way, vertically. So if you see one from really far away, one of the ways is looking for their tails to see if you can see their tails kind of a little bit above the water. The other way to tell the difference between beavers versus the other two is beavers' heads look really square. They look very square when you see them in the water. So that's another way to tell them apart. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about their adaptations, the ways that they survive in the water. So what are some ways that you think otters and beavers and muskrats can survive in the water? What are some of the characteristics that help them to survive? Webbed feet, absolutely. Warm fur, Good lungs, yeah, they can hold their breath for a very long time. And yep, fat. So actually beavers can store fat in their tails. They've got special oil, yeah, on their fur that helps to keep the water out. So this repels the water. Good swimmers, yeah, absolutely. So you guys got, I think, almost all of them. So first we have the fur. So they've got really, really thick fur. They've actually got two layers, a thicker underlayer of fur, and then they have an outer layer of fur that's a little bit more wiry. So that, and then like someone said, they have got that oil, which helps repel the water. So we've got waterproof, really warm fur, so they can stay in the water all year round. Their ears and their noses are really specially adapted to help them to swim underneath the water. So they have kind of flaps that close. They can close up their nose, they can close up their ears, so they won't get water into their noses and their ears when they go to dive. Someone said they're webbed feet. So they have webbing on their feet. Well, at least beavers and otters do. But muskrats, they actually have these teeny little hairs along the edge of their toes, and that's what helps them to swim. But they're not quite webbed, but they do have those special hairs that help them to swim. Their eyes act like goggles. So if you've ever seen your cat, if you have a cat and its eyes open, but another eyelid kind of comes over and covers its eye, that's called a nictitating membrane. It's your word of the day, and it acts like goggles. So beavers and otters and muskrats all have it. So they close that nictitating membrane, and then it acts like a pair of goggles so they can see underneath the water. So it's nice and protected. And then they use their tails to help them swim. So the beaver and the muskrat will do this, and the beavers will actually use their tails to pat down their lodge and their dam when they're building. So we'll see that in a video in just a little bit. All right. Next. So next, we learned a little bit about how they survive in the water, but it's always good to talk about where they came from and where did they go, because this is very common with animals that live in the US, because there were only Native American people here up until the Pilgrims came, and we changed the habitat and the wildlife a lot when we came over here. So when the Pilgrims came over, they saw tons and tons of land. They saw tons and tons of beavers and muskrats and otters, and they were like, hey, there's so much here. We can probably take as much as we want, and it will never, ever run out. But that wasn't the case. So nobody was regulating anything. Nobody was saying, don't take that many beavers, don't cut down those forests. There were no rules in place. So people were just taking and they would trap beavers to make coats and to make hats like the one that's pictured there. And then they would send them back to Europe, or they would trade them with the Native American people. And the Native Americans actually taught them how to trap the beavers. And so they were doing all this trading. They were getting money for the pelts. They were trading it for weapons. And this fur and this pelt was so, so valuable because it was warm and it was waterproof and it was nice and thick, just like we heard. I actually have with me, this is a muskrat pelt. So muskrats are pretty small. You can see how big it is compared to me. So this is a real muskrat pelt. It's nice and soft and thick. And they need a lot of these to make a coat, but they wouldn't need very many from a beaver because beaver are huge, especially when you have their whole pelt. And so you wouldn't need so many to make a coat, but it's very, very valuable in that sense. And so they were trapping all these beavers. They were cutting down all the forest to make way for farms, to raise livestock, to build houses. And then all of the animals started to disappear. And around the 1800s, beavers were completely gone from Rhode Island. You couldn't find a beaver here in Rhode Island. And it was similar in a lot of the surrounding states because they were completely trapped out because nobody stopped the trapping because there were no rules in place. But luckily, people started to notice this and people started to say, hey, I want beavers around. I want there to always be beavers here. I want there to always be otters and muskrats so that we can keep using them as a resource and they keep helping the environment because they're valuable in many different ways. And so they started to put laws into place like the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Act, like I was talking about before, where people have to contribute money if they are going to take an animal so that we can continue to protect their habitat. And because people kept working toward this conservation and more money was put toward conservation and more people cared, we were able to find new ways to help them. And one of the really cool things that biologists started doing and scientists started doing was introducing beavers and otters into places where they no longer were. So beavers were trapped, otters were trapped in places where they were really, really abundant, and then they would let them go somewhere else and let them start kind of creating that wetland habitat that's so important for all of those other species of wildlife. And so that's how we now have beavers back again, because there are rules for trapping. You can't take as many as you want to. And there's research being done, just like we're going to talk about with John. So speaking of John, we're going to let him talk a little bit about his project, and then we have a fun activity to try to identify some of the signs that he's looking for. So I'll hand it over to you, John.
All right. So yeah, my PhD work is pretty much what it says on the screen here. I'm looking for where each of these species are in Rhode Island. So the whole goal of the project is to establish a really solid understanding of the distribution of each of these across the whole state. So we're doing that with occupancy modeling, which in practice means I'm just paddling out to random sites or walking to random sites where we think there could be one of these animals and looking for any sign that they're there and writing down whether we saw any or not, and then going home. So we surveyed about 90 sites in our first year, which was last year. And we're gonna keep expanding. You can see on the little map there that we were mostly focused in Western and Southwestern Rhode Island. We're moving a little bit more north and east. But so far we've found plenty of evidence of all three species, pretty widely distributed across the state. You can see some beaver detections on this map, and they weren't very common on the coast, but pretty common everywhere else. So yeah, that's the basics.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. All right. Thanks, John. So what John's doing, like you said, he's looking for signs of beaver, muskrat, and otter. So today we're going to have you guys be wildlife detectives and try to figure out what signs are coming from what animals. So get ready for some evidence of animals. So number one, we have scat, as we like to call it in the science world. But to be more fun, there's a clue in the poo. So we have this scat here, and I want you to try to guess what animal you think it might come from. And the way that we do this is looking very, very closely at it, looking what might be in it, where it is. So anyone have any guesses as to what made this scat? Right, I'm seeing some answers coming in. You guys are on it. All right, so it looks like most people got it. Something that likes fish, they said. So it's the otter. So otters love fish. And you can tell that it's an otter because they're little fish scales. If you look very closely, those are little fish scales all in there. So that means whatever comes in, it's going to go out the other end. So if it's eating fish, then you're going to see evidence of that in the scat. So if John is walking along a trail, walking along a river edge looking for a sign, and he saw this, then he would see that he would know that it's from an otter because you can see those fish scales. I love fish.
Yeah, the fish scales are very indicative of otters. Sometimes you can get their scat confused with raccoons because they make similar piles, but the raccoons don't eat nearly as many fish or crayfish. So that really is the most clear sign, is those fish scales.
Awesome, thanks, John. So we know that otters love fish, but there's a reason why they do, and it's because they're different from beavers and muskrats in that they are mustelids, which is the weasel family. So they're like cousins of mink and fisher and badger and all of those animals. And mustelids are carnivores. So just like your dog or a coyote or any other animal with these kind of sharp pointy teeth, they like to eat meat. And so they're hunters. So this is an otter skull that I have here. You can see those really big teeth, really sharp teeth. Those are perfect for catching fish. The other ways that you can tell an animal is a mustelid is that they'll have really long bodies. So otters are very long. If you've ever seen a fisher before, they're very long. They have short little legs. They've got pretty small heads. So it doesn't look like it's a head and then a neck. It looks like it's one kind of like tube shape. And then they also have very strong necks, which is great for otters when they're swimming and trying to catch fish. All right, our next one, there's a clue in the chew. Who left this sign? Put your answers in the chat. Guys are doing great. Beaver, 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 beaver. Everyone knows it's a beaver. So this is probably the most obvious sign. Am I right, John?
Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing else in Rhode Island that would chew on a big piece of wood like that. It's always going to be a beaver.
Mm-hmm. And then I remember John was telling us before about how it's really hard. It's easy when it's a giant tree that a beaver is chewed on, but if it's something that's not wood, then it could be maybe a muskrat, and it can be hard to tell the difference between a beaver and a muskrat if they're chewing on some of the soft vegetation like cattails or any kind of those wetland aquatic vegetation, those wetland grasses and things.
Ideally, you could look, if you had a really clear sign in vegetation, you could look at the size of their teeth because beavers are bigger, but they don't always leave the really clear tooth marks in softer vegetation. But in chewed trees like this, you can often look closely and see where those big front teeth of a beaver scraped on the wood.
Mm-hmm. And there are otters, all these animals that we're talking about today. I see someone put it in the chat. Otters, beavers, and muskrats all are in Rhode Island. So that's John studying them. They're all here in Rhode Island. You can go out and find them and look for this evidence tomorrow if you want to. So beavers and muskrats, like I said, they're different than the otters because they are actually rodents. So just like mice and squirrels and chipmunks, they're rodents. So they have different looking skulls and different looking teeth. So this is a muskrat and this is a beaver. So you can see one's much bigger. Sorry, one's farther away. One's much bigger than the other. So this is our beaver. This is our muskrat. I don't have the bottom jaw because it's in two pieces. It's very hard to hold up. But you can see they've got those two sets of front incisors, those two front teeth, and they will grow and grow and grow. So that is one of the ways that you can know it is a rodent, is if they have those front teeth that just keep growing and growing. And that's why they're chewing and chewing. That's why the mice are chewing in my attic. They were chewing all last night. They're chewing in my attic. The squirrels are always chewing on things. The beavers are always chewing on trees. They have to keep chewing or their teeth will actually grow, and they could grow into their skull if they don't keep chewing. They're herbivores mostly, so they'll eat things like that aquatic vegetation and like the outer layer of trees. And they'll actually be able to digest that and use it to fuel their bodies, which is not that common. So you can see their teeth look orange, and that is because they're kind of reinforced with iron. And that way, see if I can show it close enough. It's kind of hard to see. That way the outer layer stays longer because it's harder to wear down. The inner layer stays a little bit shorter, and it creates this kind of sharp edge, and that's what allows them to chew through things so well. And then with rodents, they usually have a really thick body, got short legs again. They usually have a long tail, and then again, they have those ever-growing teeth, those teeth that won't stop growing. And then, so someone just asked why beavers chew trees and the pattern that we saw. So John, do you have an answer to that one?
I think it's mostly just that it's the easiest way through the tree. They will, on smaller sticks, you'll see a pretty clear diagonal pattern, but on a big tree like we saw before, they'll make that diagonal on each side just to bring it down as quickly as they can and start using it in whatever they're using it for.
Yep. And there, that it was in that circle that's all at that one height, because beavers, they can't really climb all that well, so they're going to try to chew where it's convenient for them to chew. So it's easiest for them to chew it from the ground, so it's going to be in that kind of same height. All right, last trivia. There's a clue in the shoe if animals wore shoes. So there's a clue in the tracks. Anyone have a guess what this track came from? This one might be a little bit harder, a little trickier. Someone said a fisher, otter, beaver tail, otter slide, tail drag, maybe a ferret, muskrat, beaver feet and tail. All right, this one was the trickiest one, and tracks are very hard, I have to say. You see a giant chewed tree, you're pretty sure it's from a beaver. Not much else is going to do that. But John was telling us, tracks are hard, especially when they're not very clear. So the answer is the beaver. The otter. The otter. They like to slide in the snow, like somebody said. So we have that big thick body slide, so not much else is going to slide like that, and usually it would be close to water. You'd expect to see this, and then you'd look for other signs. So now you know what the scat looks like, so you'd look for scat. It might have slid, but then it's going to start walking again, and so it's hard to see sometimes in like the snow or the mud, because these can be in the mud too, but there are ways to identify the different tracks. So what would you say is the number one sign that you usually see, John? What do you usually find?
across all species, it's definitely beaver-toed sticks. For the muskrats, it's usually scat, and for otters, it's usually also scat. And of the three, I see the most otter tracks, mostly because they spend, I think, more of their time walking around, and they choose relatively obvious places to walk, and they do their belly sliding, which is pretty distinctive once you've seen a few of them. Yeah.
Awesome. So if you don't see a belly slide, you might see there are other types of tracks. So we've got 3 sets of tracks here. One is from otters, one's from muskrats, and one is from beavers. So do we have a guess what letter A is from? What left the tracks in letter A? I see beaver, I see otter. Beaver, otter. Right, we got kind of a mix of both, either an otter or a beaver. We're not quite sure. They can be a little bit tricky to tell apart.
So I think the one that's otter is probably the smaller ones, the C.
That's a very good guess. They all look so much alike. Sometimes.
Wait, hold on. That one's the right track. That looks a bit familiar. I guess in probably one of those two. Because that one, the last one, the first one looked like a wolf.
Not a wolf. So we got letter A is an otter. So letter A is an otter. You can tell because they have short toes. They've got little short toes, not very long. You can tell a little bit by the size. So it's a kind of medium-sized track. And then they have a chevron, so a shape that's kind of like an upside down, like wide V kind of a shape, or like an arrowhead on as their pad. So this part is shaped kind of like an arrow, and they have 5 toes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the bottom is kind of like rounded looking. And so that's how you can tell. They look a lot like, they can look a lot like fisher tracks sometimes. Sometimes you can see the tail drag, or you might find a slide, and then that would help you to identify it as an otter. But what about letter B? So this one's a little bit different.
Oh boy.
So someone said heavier animal equals deeper tracks. Kind of depends, because it could be really squishy mud. So it could be a light animal and really squishy mud, or really soft snow, and it might look like it might be heavier, but it's hard to tell based on the substrate or what it's walking on. I don't know why I put beavers as B every time. It's like a giveaway, but B is a beaver. You guys are right. Correct. So we've got those really obviously webbed feet, so you can see the webbing on them. You won't always see that because sometimes they're not spread out quite as much, so you might not see the webbing. But they're big. They're really, really big. If you saw these in person, they'd be about the size of your hand, an adult hand. And they've got really long toes. If you can see the webbing, that's very helpful. And then looking at the tracks, when they're walking, their hind foot, so their back foot steps on top of the track from their front foot. So you can see in the image, it looks like they're overlapping. So that's another way that you can tell. And then the difference, if say these looked really similar because the tracks weren't great, you could look at the bottom, and it looks kind of like a V-shaped rather than rounded, like the bottom of the otter track. And so then the last one, we can probably guess. It's our muskrat. You got it. So it's our muskrat track. It's going to be way, way smaller. So if you see a little track that has 4 toes, then it's going to be a muskrat. And the best part that I learned when I was looking at my track book the other day about muskrat tracks is that they have another little thing coming off that's not quite a toe, and it's called a nubbin. And I thought that was probably the best word I've ever heard. So muskrats have a nubbin. All right, So there are a few other signs that you can look for to find these animals. So the very obvious one, another big sign is going to be a beaver lodge, and this is the place where they live. So these lodges have the entrances underneath the water, and they usually have two, and that way they have to swim under the water to get up into the opening within the lodge, and there'll be sometimes multiple generations living in that lodge all together. Muskrats also will build a lodge, but it'll be much smaller, and usually it's not made of sticks, but it's made of things like grasses and reeds and things like that. It'll be like look like a mini beaver lodge with greener stuff. And then otters, they move around really frequently. So they sometimes will use a little den, which is like a little hole in the bank of a river, but they won't stay in one place for a very long time. And usually they travel in pairs. So it's hard to find these guys because they move around a lot. So it's hard to say there are two beaver or two otter in this area because they might move somewhere else pretty quickly. And I also have a video that I want to show you. It's pretty quick. I'll take a look. Let me stop sharing, and then let me share. With sound. Yes, this one. All right. So here's our video. Tell me if you can't hear it.
Felling trees with your teeth takes great strength, skill, and patience. One technique is to slice halfway through and let the wind do the rest. The beaver's incisors are strengthened with iron, which makes them orange. They grow continuously and even self-sharpen. The pond makes it easier to move around the heavy logs they need to build their dams. Out of the water, it's a struggle. Stones help weigh down the base. The whole family works together, carefully interlocking the timber. They dredge mud from the pond bottom to seal the dam. Each pond traps several inches of sediment every year, so there's plenty of it. The young act as apprentice builders, learning the tricks of the trade. The final results are impressive. In the Rocky Mountains, beaver dams slowly filter billions of tons of water. The ponds build up soil and nutrients and help prevent floods and droughts.
Right, just want to show you that quick video. It's kind of neat to see the beavers carrying around the logs and the mud, and it's funny when he has all the vegetation on his head, but it's neat how they're able to alter their landscapes so much. Right, back to here. All right, is it showing all right, John?
I'm seeing your presenter view.
All right, let me. Try this again. All right, good. All right, perfect. So next. Oh no, it's taking me back to the video. Hold on one second, sorry. I told you I would have technological difficulties. All right, good again? Perfect. There we go. All right, so we kind of went over how John is finding these things, but what has he found from all this evidence that he's collected. So we've got some really cool graphs that he's put together here that he's going to talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, so these maps are showing where we found each of these species on our surveys. And I'll start at the left there with the beaver detections. You've already seen this map because we had it up earlier. But beavers were very common in the Pawcatuck and Quinnebog watersheds in the sites that we surveyed. They were much less common down on the south coast. We saw a bunch of them along the Pawcatuck and Wood rivers especially. And otters we saw in a bunch of different places we didn't see as often, but they were kind of widely distributed throughout the sites that we went to. And then muskrats were, again, not as common as beavers, not quite as widely distributed as the otters, and they tended to be concentrated along a few of the rivers that they really liked. Again, the Pawcatuck and Wood River. And these are just the 3 watersheds that we started with last year. And again, we'll be moving into more northern and eastern parts of Rhode Island this year and next year. So
yeah, we're looking forward to seeing what else you find. So we have all of these answers to questions that we haven't gone over yet. So we have all these answers. Why do we need to know these things? So at Fish and Wildlife, we have done some surveys of beavers in the state, but it's pretty hard to collect a lot of information with just us because we have one biologist who works on all of the fur bearers in the state, who is Charlie Brown. And he works on everything that can be trapped or hunted in some ways. So things like beavers, otters cannot be trapped. Muskrats, fisher, anything like that, he's in charge of. So he's got a lot on his plate. So it's great to have the help of URI to help kind of figure out what's going on with these animals. Historically, we've collected information on these populations through trapping. But that means that it's dependent on how many trappers there are. So are there a lot of people trapping beavers, or are there a few? Because if there are a lot, then it's going to seem like, oh, well, they're getting so many beavers. If there are a few, then they're not going to get quite as many. And the reason why it matters how many beavers or how many otters or where muskrats are is because sometimes it can cause an issue with humans. There can be conflicts or problems between humans and wildlife. For example, if a beaver decides to build a dam and it floods an area where there's a house, or if a beaver built a dam and then the dam breaks and downstream are lots of houses or roads, those places are going to get flooded with all that backed up water. And then it also matters in management. So we're allowing people to trap muskrats and beavers in the state, but we need to know how many is a healthy number for them to trap so that the population can keep going, but not so big that it causes these conflicts to occur. And then we have to figure out coexistence. So how to work together. How can we live alongside each other and all get along so that beavers can build nice habitat for things like wood ducks or some of our other wetland species, turtles, frogs, all depend on beavers creating these nice wetland habitats. But also we don't want them flooding our houses and flooding the roads. So from John's information, we'll be able to figure out where they are likely to occur, and then we can kind of build around them rather than through them. So it's a good way to coexist with these animals. And it's all really a balancing act because we don't want too many, because then they're gonna overpopulate. It's gonna cause lots of issues for us and for the wildlife. We don't want too few because we need these animals. They're important for many reasons, just like we were talking about, or they were talking about in that video. They're important because the dams, they contain nutrients, they create habitat for wildlife, they filter out kind of toxins from the water. So they're important in a lot of different ways. In the past, the Native American people have been able to coexist with all of these animals And they've been able to harvest these resources in a sustainable way, a way that's going to make sure that they're around for a really, really long time. And so that's what we want to do, is make sure that we have that nice balance so that we have the animals that are important to the ecosystem, but they're not damaging our livelihoods. And so we have rules. So like I said, there is no trapping for otters in Rhode Island. There is a limit on the number of beavers and muskrats that you can trap, and you can only take them in a certain season. And we try to make sure that when people are trapping animals, they're trapping in a season where it's not going to harm their young. And also with fur bearers, like animals like beaver and muskrat that have that really nice fur, they get that really, really nice fur in the winter. So we try to align it with the time when the pelts are going to be the most valuable and useful for clothing. And if you want to learn more about trapping, you can look at our hunting and trapping abstract. It has all the rules in it. So that is all we have for today. You guys did a great job being wildlife detectives. So with that, I think we can start answering some questions, and we can stop the recording. So if people want to